From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. So, the Epstein files are out, millions of pages, thousands of videos, an order from Congress. And what have we learned? Well, Democrats accused the Attorney General of a cover-up. The Attorney General calls a senior congressman a washed-up loser lawyer. Victims sit in the room watching their accusers' names blacked out, while their own names, their photographs, their suffering are leaked to the public. Welcome to accountability, Western style. For years, the Western elites, the Western men, have stood on what they call the moral high ground. They lecture other countries on human rights, on fair courts, on the worth of every person. They send diplomats to lecture former colonies about the rule of law, as if that law were a custom-made suit only for a rich man. And then comes along Jeffrey Epstein. This case shows elites making good manners for real goodness. Words like philanthropy, networking, mentorship, and private dinners. These became tools to clean up reputations, even after the 2008 conviction. Now, let me be clear. This is not about one man. It is about what Julie K. Brown, the reporter who broke the story in the first place, said with painful honesty. Nearly every element of society allowed him to get away with them. Not one element, every element. Let's walk through the Museum of Western Hypocrisy. In 2007, federal prosecutors had 82 pages of documents to charge him, Epstein, a 53-page draft of charges. Victims as young as 14 years old. They had the evidence. What happened next was not a failure. It was a choice, a secret deal, negotiated in private, kept from the victim for nearly a year. When the government finally wrote to these victims, it told them the case was still under investigation. A federal judge caught this, and I quote, actively misleading them. Now, Alex Acosta, the prosecutor who signed the deal, sat for an interview with the Justice Department's internal investigators. His defense? He couldn't remember. Didn't recall the financial records, didn't recall the flight logs. Now, years later, his testimony to Congress was so full of, I don't remember, that word memory became his legal excuse. This is the system that lectures the world on fair and independent courts. But the courts were only the first domino. Let us talk about the gentleman, the European gentleman. I'm not just talking about the businesses and the finance circles who made up the bulk of the Epstein guest list, but in academia as well. Scholars who fill university offices. According to documents released this month and reported by Nature, Epstein kept a list of nearly 30 well-known scientists. He invested millions. At Harvard, he gave $6.5 million to start a research program. He visited more than 40 times at Harvard in 2018 rather. He kept an office there. A virus expert at Stanford asked Epstein to pay for a study on college students' sexual behavior to test, and I quote, our horny virus idea. A physics professor facing investigation into his own misconduct received an email from Epstein telling him to say no comment to the press. This is not just selling influence. This is intellectuals bound down. Men who trade in fame and respect traded it for a check from a convicted sex offender. And the banks? Deutsche Bank moved millions of dollars for Epstein. They flagged him as high risk. They kept him anyway. Wire transfers, cash withdrawals, payments to people accused of helping him. New York's financial regulator called it inexcusable. The bank paid $150 million to settle the case. And let me translate that. $150 million is not punishment. It is simply the price they pay to make the problem go away. And now we arrive at the truly interesting part. The Epstein files have become a political punching bag. The Trump camp makes it about the Clintons. The Democrats make it about the Republicans. The Attorney General accuses the committee chairman of drama, and the chairman himself accuses the Attorney General of running a cover-up. Meanwhile, the law Congress passes clearly states that names cannot be blacked out just to avoid embarrassment, harm to reputation, or political discomfort. So, how did the Department of Justice manage to black out the powerful and expose the victims whose names were published, whose nude photographs were passed around, whose families learned of their trafficking only through public records? Now, one survivor put it simply. She said, "This administration has basically been lying to us and making us doubt our own reality the entire time, lying and manipulating." So here's the uncomfortable truth the West does not want to face. The Epstein archive is not just one file on one criminal. It is a CT scan of the whole system, the courts, the banks, the politicians, even some academic institutions. Not evil in some movie sense, silent partners in real world sense. Silent through doing nothing, through convenient forgetfulness, through the quiet belief that some men are too powerful to ever be brought down. And yet these same institutions continue to grade the rest of the world on human rights, continue to issue report cards on judicial reform, continue to act as if they're the world's moral judge. The lease on that high ground has run out. It ran out in Florida courthouse in 2008. It ran out on the private Caribbean island with the Harvard professor as a guest. It ran out this month on the live television when the victim had to watch her abuser's name being blacked out while her own name staying in plain sight. The Western elites wanted to be judged by their good intentions. Unfortunately for them, the Epstein files contain only the facts. Now, to discuss further into all these questions and more, we're joined today in Washington, D.C. by Madam Rina Shah, geopolitical advisor, and also in Washington, D.C. by Brandon Andrews, entrepreneur and former Hill staffer. And last, but certainly not least, in Shanghai, China, we have Josef Mahoney, professor of politics from East China Normal University. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for putting up with my take now for a deeper analysis into all these. I want to ask you about this. So, Rina, why don't I go to you? Why should the world care about the Epstein case, in your opinion? I mean, it began as a U.S. criminal investigation, but quickly became a global headline. What did they expose, in your opinion?
Well, certainly this global story bears attention from all parts of the globe because it is not just one that is about elites. It is about the gap between the rules we're told that exist and the rules that actually apply. And when elite networks span continents, but accountability stops at national borders, I think that's not just an American problem then. It's a governance crisis for democracies everywhere.
Democracies everywhere, victims as well as guests do span continents and across sectors. Brandon, I mean, how do you look at all this? Brandon in Washington, D.C., can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, James Madison, one of the founding fathers of the United States, said, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. And I think we see this playing out with the justice system. The system is in place, the rule of law, equal representation under the law, and other pieces. But we've seen where where people come in with bias, with influence, with relationships, the things you alluded to in your opening take, that cause a deleterious effect when it comes to the implementation of the justice system and the even implementation of law. And what we have now is, as you said, the inequity being exposed, both being exposed in terms of things that the current administration has said and done, but also being exposed in terms of what people said and maybe perhaps more so what they didn't say and didn't do over the past 30 years with knowledge of Jeffrey Epstein and his crimes.
Now, Joseph, the case unfolded in an era shaped by algorithm-driven amplifications. Has social media fundamentally changed how power scandals spread and gain traction?
It's a double-sided question. On the one hand, we know that a lot of those algorithms are controlled by tech elites, that the tech elites belong to the oligarchy, that a big part of that tech oligarchy is supporting the current administration, in part because they want protections from other countries in the global marketplace. They want protections from China. And so this is the case. But at the same time, algorithms and social media have a global reach now, and certainly people can get into the conversation and start influencing things. But one of the problems that I'm seeing with the algorithm, just from watching it from my own vantage point, is the way that the algorithm is being manipulated, for example, to highlight sort of marginal cases in the files. We see conservative and right-wing media overemphasizing the role of people of color who have been associated with Epstein, when the vast majority have been rich white men with sexual deviancies. So there's sort of this opportunity for us to sort of learn something, but at the same time to risk being further misguided through new forms of misinformation by some of the very elites who were connected, some of these tech elites who were also connected to Epstein and who want to participate in a broad cover-up or to mislead people into the reality, to sort of foster or continue to advance the hyper-reality that people have been living in for more than a couple of decades now.
Yeah, we do see digital media serving as a double-edged sword. Now, Rina, the Congress explicitly said that certain names cannot be redacted, merely because it makes some people politically uncomfortable, hiding truth from the public, the mass. Yet we do see victims, even some of their nude photos being spread around, underage girls. How does all this concern you?
Well, I think this is all very tough to swallow if you've looked at the plight of women coming from disadvantaged homes. And a lot of these victims were. This was about girls, again, coming from certain backgrounds that took an opportunity and were trafficked, essentially, by Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. So to me, this was, if you're looking at the man or the networks here, I look at this as Epstein being a node, not the network. What terrifies people is realizing that power operates through relationships that most of us never see, and that these circles seem to have their own immune system against the consequences. But when you look at how Epstein, how he damaged the public trust, that to me is also a really significant portion of this, because with his death, what we saw in the age of information is that incompleteness really feels intentional. When the most high-profile prisoner, again, Jeffrey Epstein in America, dies under suspicious circumstances, and we get bureaucratic shrugs, essentially, instead of answers, that's not a trust problem, that's a trust demolition.
A trust demolition. Now, Brandon, we do see the reality where the Epstein episode has been used as a political football kicked back and forth by the left and the right. What does this say about the judicial system currently serving the U.S. society?
Yeah, the principles of the judicial system are solid. So equal representation under the law, rule of law, guaranteed representation, etc. But we see in practice fractures, and indeed you talk about a political football being passed around, you talk about shots being taken by different political parties. You hear this term, the two-tiered justice system, thrown around a lot in these conversations. Now, if you went back in the United States 20 or 30 years and you heard someone say two-tiered justice system, you would almost automatically say that's a Democrat talking about it, because Democrats had for decades been talking about the use of cash bail bonds, keeping people in jail, and non-violent drug offenses, keeping people in jail for years, people not getting access to the same kinds of representation that wealthy folks in the United States would have access to. But over the past 10 years in the Trump era, especially as Donald Trump and others have been in court themselves, themselves have had charges brought against them. You hear them talking about now a two-tier justice system where they see Republicans and conservatives or people in Donald Trump's network being charged with things that they don't think other people would be. And here with the Jeffrey Epstein case, we have everyone talking about a two-tier justice system where we have a wealthy financier being able to over and over again get out of things. And even when he was finally charged, he was ultimately, as you mentioned, as Rina mentioned, dying under suspicious circumstances, with some people feeling like he should have, served out his whole system to really be punished for what he did. And so Republicans and Democrats are on Capitol Hill are going to take whatever opportunity they can to take shots at each other. But you see both parties uniting and saying there's a two-tier justice system here. The question is, will there actually be justice for the victims, one, and two, will any steps be taken to rectify some of the inequities that are there when it comes to the application of justice in the U.S.?
Right. I'm not saying any country's legal system is perfect. Singapore is not perfect. Korea is not perfect. Japan is not perfect. China is probably not perfect either. But Joseph, we've for the longest time heard from the U.S. and the U.K. positioning themselves as champion of rule of law and executors of checks and balances and having de facto rule of law, not just de jure. Do scandals like this undermine their credibility and trust towards their institutions and their capability to have legitimate checks and balances?
It's a good question. Again, I think that we've had this principle of checks and balances. We've had this principle of democracy, but at the same time, we've had for more than several decades now this concern among leading American political scientists that the United States is in fact not a democracy but an oligarchy. You can go all the way back to the 1950s, 1960s to the rise of sort of Straussian philosophy coming out of the University of Chicago, which we've been able to trace as having a tremendous influence in successive administrations, reaching a clear apex during the George W. Bush administration. This idea of the noble lie that elites have a responsibility to manipulate people for their own good, but who really gets to determine that good? The problem that we see with Trump, I think, is as the system has continued to degenerate and decline, it's become more and more difficult to lie about the true nature of the system. And so what we've seen is not transparency in an absolute sense, but for example, the unprecedented use or abuse of executive power by the president, including for self-enrichment, the complete failure of Congress to not only legislate, which has led to even more abuses through a rule by executive order, but simply refusing to exercise this checks and balance by holding the administration accountable for its excesses. We've seen the politicization of the courts, the politicization of the Department of Justice, unprecedentedly. We've seen the politicization of the FBI. No one believed the FBI director when he said a couple of days ago that there's no evidence that Epstein trafficked women on behalf of others. So it is, I think, sort of revealing the nature of the system. It's a nature that we've suspected for a long time. It's just simply impossible to cover that up, although they're still able to sort of, I think, hide some of the darker elements. Maybe more and more of these are going to come into the open now.
Yeah, thanks for all these insights. Now, Rina, the investigation stalled after Epstein's death, of course, and the files were not released last year, despite Attorney General Pam Bondi's commitment to do so almost a year ago. How do you look at the fact that the momentum seems to be stopping and that there are gaps here and there? For example, Congress required the release of 6 million pages of records, but only half or so were disclosed.
Yeah, I believe the momentum faded because nobody powerful benefits from complete transparency. I think that's a fact that we have to acknowledge here. And add in bureaucratic inertia there. media fatigue, for example, and genuine legal complexity around privacy, and you get the perfect storm essentially for institutional amnesia. And so scandals fade when no faction has the incentive to keep pushing. I think that's what we really saw happen there. But why were only half of the mandated files released? I think that's a really big question that ought to be answered. For example, when Congress makes a mandate there, they mandated that 6 million pages should be released, and we only saw 3 million be released. We have to ask then, whose names are in the other half? This isn't transparency. Let's be frank about it. It's selective disclosure, and it makes people think this system protects its own.
System protecting its own. I mean, Brandon, how do you look at this? Survivors' names and sensitive details were widely believed to be mishandled. Some names were protected, so on and so forth.
Yet for this to have been such a big issue now, inflation, the economy, affordability, those were the main issues in the presidential campaign. But there probably wasn't one campaign event that Donald Trump did where the Epstein files didn't come up. And indeed, he promised to release them. And indeed, Pam Bondi, after she was confirmed as Attorney General, promised to release them. She said, I have the list on my desk. I'm going to release them. And then all of a sudden, the list doesn't exist. And then she gets mandated by Congress to release the records. And as Rina said, only half of the records get released. The Trump administration, I'm sure, would love to move on from this and talk about Trump accounts, investment accounts, talk about 5 million small businesses being started in the U.S. in 2025, but they can't because they continue to give the media, to give Americans reasons to ask questions, reasons to get this story back going again. And so, yes, not only have the details when it comes to the privacy of some of the victims been mishandled, but from a political strategy standpoint, from a communication strategy standpoint, from the administration, something that was a significant benefit for the campaign has now become almost an albatross around the neck of the Trump administration. Now, 1 year or so into the second term of President Trump, and so the big question is, yes, can we get justice for the victims, but also can the Trump administration do what they say they're going to do, release the files, not overly redact, and release it in a way so people don't have questions and so that they can move on, and so again that the victims can get the justice that they want. Indeed.
Yeah. I mean, we've known the life of rich and famous. I mean, President Trump, during his first term in office, even jokingly said in the White House press conference, when asked about the privileges the rich and famous had in America, he said, that has been the story of life. And that video went viral on Chinese social media as well. So Joseph, what about this Epstein episode that surprised you the most? What are the facts that surprise you from what you don't know previously about the life of the rich and famous? Not just in America, let me say, but around the world.
Well, I think the thing that's really surprising a lot of people is that since the maybe late 1970s, early 1980s, we've seen the middle class being hollowed out. We've seen failure to really deal with income inequality, really to deal with other social problems given systemic breakdowns. At the same time, there's since we started that downward trajectory, there's been a lot of cynicism, periodic outbursts of anger about perceiving the privileges benefit from things like insider trading, corrupt campaign finance, various schemes for evading taxes, and certainly some exceptional cases where people can avoid prosecution or punishment for more grotesque criminal offenses, or later buying some sort of pardon. But I think what we're seeing now is a lot of people who are fundamentally concerned that we might have a system in place where people are able to rape and even kill children, above all those from the working classes, and perhaps even commit treason, and that this is the system that is then telling them that they need to cut their health benefits or that they need to accept other types of reforms that are still leaving them diminished. So this is, I think, a real crisis. There was this old Alexander Pope phrase, "Hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is, but is always to be blessed." This has always been sort of a faith thing. It was an essay that was taught to me in the 10th grade in the United States. I think people increasingly are losing faith in the capacity of this system to rectify itself, and it begs the question of what comes next.
It does beg that question. Now, Rina, what details or facts about the Epstein episode that do you find most appalling?
Well, I think for me, it's in general what this exposes about American justice. I mean, I think that wealth is the best defense that money can buy here, literally. That's what we see on display with this whole thing. I think the 2008 sweetheart deal showed that prosecutorial discretion has a price tag as well. That's disturbing. I think when the well-connected can delay, essentially settle privately even, and wait out scandals like regular people cannot do, then equal justice becomes a nice story that we just tell ourselves. So I really just wonder at this point, can moving on restore trust? That's what I'm most curious about. There wasn't, there was of course explosive information in those files, and yes, some of it was shocking to find out the extent of the crimes. It felt like, or who was involved, those salacious details. But when we talk about how our country moves forward, it feels like this is a story that is not going to die. We have to really ask and search deep within. Can we move on without proper accountability? Because moving on without accountability just proves that patience defeats justice if you're powerful enough. And so you don't restore trust by asking people to forget. You restore it by completing the investigation, releasing the files fully, and holding people accountable. Anything less than that confirms exactly what people already suspect, that different rules are for different people. And so that is what's top of mind for me right now versus all the salacious details in the files themselves.
Yeah, we have about 1 minute left. Brandon, what are your biggest takeaways?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway is Jeffrey Epstein is a monster. What he did was incredibly heinous. There's an opportunity here for not only the Trump administration, but for U.S. government more generally to bring justice for the victims and restore faith in the justice system. I think America is a place where that can happen, and I hope they take the right step.
And in light of the midterm elections where, electoral politics heats up, and from now to November, you think it will happen?
There will be increasing pressure to complete this and to get justice for the victims. This story isn't going away. I know the Trump administration would like for it to, but until this thing is settled, files are released, and victims come out and say, we're happy with the results here, they're going to continue to hear a groundswell of support for victims and a continued push from both Trump supporters and folks on the other side to get this addressed fully.
I want to thank all of our guests for their very insightful analysis. Thank you all so very much. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you so much for tuning in. Our programs continue on CGTN. Stay tuned and see you next time.